Some doors are locked not to keep you out, but to keep them in.
Chapter 1: Fire in California. My name is Sarah Monroe, and I never thought I'd witness the end of my hometown. Santa Lucia, nestled between the dry hills of California, wasn't famous or glamorous like the cities closer to Los Angeles. It was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where kids rode their bikes to the general store and sunsets painted the hills in shades of gold. But now, those hills were burning. The wildfire had started days ago, sparked by the relentless Santa Ana winds. At first, we thought it was just another seasonal blaze, dangerous, yes, but manageable. We were used to fire warnings and evacuation drills. But this time, it was different. The flames spread faster than anyone expected, devouring everything in their path. Entire neighborhoods turned to ash within hours. The town was under mandatory evacuation. People packed their cars with whatever they could grab, photo albums, clothes, pets, and fled, leaving behind homes filled with memories. I stayed behind. Not out of bravery, but necessity. I worked as a nurse at the town's only clinic, and some people couldn't leave. Elderly patients, those too sick or frail to make the journey. I couldn't abandon them. The sky was a sickly orange, thick with smoke, as I drove through the deserted streets. Santa Lucia looked like a ghost town. Ash floated down like snowflakes, coating everything in a gray film. I passed familiar landmarks, the diner where I had my first job, the park where my brother used to play, all abandoned, eerily silent. My radio crackled with static, then a warning from the emergency services: the fire is moving north. Evacuate immediately. Do not wait. I pulled into the clinic's parking lot and hurried inside. Dr. Carter, a stoic man in his 60s, was tending to Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman with a broken hip. We have to move, I told him, my voice trembling. The fire's getting closer. He glanced out the window, his expression grim. We're not going anywhere with her in this condition. The ambulance isn't coming. They're stretched too thin. Panic bubbled in my chest. Then what do we do? Dr. Carter's gaze locked onto mine. We wait. And we pray. As night fell, the clinic's generator hummed softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I sat by the window, watching the horizon glow with an ominous red light. The fire was getting closer. The air smelled of smoke and charred wood. Then I heard it, a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was just debris hitting the windows. But the tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I stood, my heart pounding, and approached the window. Outside, the street was empty. Shadows danced in the firelight, but there was no one there. Sarah? Dr. Carter called from the back room. Everything okay? Yeah, I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady. It's nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. The tapping resumed, louder this time. I pressed my face to the glass, scanning the street. My breath fogged up the window, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the distance. A woman, draped in black, her long hair billowing in the wind. I blinked, and she was gone. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. Dr. Carter? He appeared in the doorway, his face lined with worry. What is it? There's someone outside. He frowned, grabbing a flashlight. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "No. Wait." I reached out to stop him, but he was already heading for the door. I watched helplessly as he stepped into the smoky night, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" his voice echoed. "Is anyone there?" The tapping started again, this time from the roof. I gasped, looking up. Shadows moved across the ceiling, too quick to be trees swaying in the wind. Something was up there. Dr. Carter returned, shaking his head. "No one's out there. Just the wind." "It's not the wind," I whispered. He opened his mouth to respond, but the lights flickered and went out, plunging the clinic into darkness. The generator had failed. "Damn it," Dr. Carter muttered. "Stay here. I'll check the generator." As he disappeared into the back, I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from all directions now, the windows, the walls, the ceiling. "Sarah," a voice whispered. I froze. "Who's there?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the tapping grew into a deafening pounding, shaking the walls of the clinic. The windows rattled, and I stumbled backward, tripping over a chair. "Sarah," the voice called again, closer this time. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse racing. The pounding stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Dr. Carter burst back into the room, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now." "What's going on?" I demanded. "The fire's surrounding us. We don't have much time." We helped Mrs. Henderson into a wheelchair and hurried toward the door. But as we stepped outside, the figure I'd seen earlier was there, standing at the edge of the parking lot. "Who are you?" Dr. Carter demanded. The woman lifted her head, revealing hollow, blackened eyes. Her lips twisted into a chilling smile. "You let it in," she whispered. "And now, it won't leave." Flames roared in the distance, and as the fire closed in, I realized the truth. The fire wasn't just a natural disaster. It was something ancient, something evil. And it was hungry. Chapter 2, Whisper. The night after seeing the figure in the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her hollow, blackened eyes staring back at me, her chilling words echoing in my mind, "You let it in." I sat by the clinic window, watching the distant hills glow with firelight. The flames hadn't reached us yet, but the smoke was thicker, the air heavier. It felt like the town itself was suffocating. Dr. Carter hadn't said much since our encounter with the woman. He was keeping busy, tending to Mrs. Henderson and checking the generator, but I could tell he was rattled. Every so often, he'd glance toward the windows, his jaw clenched. Around midnight, the tapping started again. This time, it came from the back door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rhythmic sound echoed through the clinic, deliberate and unnerving. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, turning to Dr. Carter. He nodded slowly, grabbing his flashlight. "Stay here." "No," I said firmly. "We're not splitting up. Not again." He hesitated, then handed me a second flashlight. Together, we made our way toward the back of the clinic. The tapping continued, steady and relentless, like fingers drumming against wood. When we reached the door, Dr. Carter pressed his ear to it, listening. The tapping stopped. "Hello?" he called out. Silence. He reached for the doorknob, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't. We need to see who's out there," he insisted. Before I could argue, the door swung open on its own. The air outside was thick with smoke, but there was no one there. Just the empty parking lot, illuminated by the flickering streetlights. Dr. Carter stepped outside cautiously, sweeping his flashlight across the lot. "There's nothing here." I stayed in the doorway, my eyes darting between the shadows. "It's not nothing," I whispered. "It's something." As we turned to go back inside, the tapping resumed, this time from the roof. The sound was louder, more insistent. Dr. Carter cursed under his breath. "It's just debris," he muttered. "The wind." But I knew better. The wind didn't tap like that. We returned to the main room, locking the doors behind us. The tapping continued, moving from the roof to the walls, then to the windows. It was as if something was circling the clinic, searching for a way in. "Sarah." The voice sent chills down my spine. It was soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. My name. Dr. Carter heard it too. His face went pale. "Did you?" I nodded. "Yeah. I heard it." We stood in tense silence, listening. The voice came again, closer this time. "Sarah, let me in." I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. "What do you want?" I whispered. There was no answer. Just more tapping, more whispers. Dr. Carter grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now." "We can't," I said. "The fire's everywhere. We'll find a way." We gathered our supplies quickly, helping Mrs. Henderson into her wheelchair. As we moved toward the front door, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening, suffocating. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out. The generator had failed again, plunging the clinic into darkness. "Damn it," Dr. Carter muttered, fumbling for his flashlight. I turned on my phone's flashlight, casting a dim glow across the room. Shadows danced on the walls, shifting and twisting like living things. "Sarah." The voice was right behind me. I spun around, shining my light toward the sound. Nothing. Just empty space. "We need to move," Dr. Carter urged, pushing Mrs. Henderson toward the door. As we stepped outside, the air was stifling. The fire had crept closer, the horizon glowing a deep, angry red. Ash floated down like snow, covering everything in a fine gray dust. The tapping started again, this time from the roof of the clinic. I looked up, my heart in my throat. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the firelight. The woman in black. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind. Dr. Carter grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the truck. "Get in." We loaded Mrs. Henderson into the back seat and climbed in. As Dr. Carter started the engine, the woman disappeared from the roof, vanishing into the smoke. We drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the crackle of the distant fire. "She's following us," I whispered, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror. Dr. Carter didn't respond. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. After a few miles, we reached the outskirts of town. The road stretched out before us, winding through the dark hills. "Do you think we're safe?" I asked. Dr. Carter shook his head. "I don't know." As we drove on, the tapping started again, this time from inside the truck. Chapter 3, Run and Don't Look Back. The tapping inside the truck grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the cramped space. Dr. Carter tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles bone white. I clutched my phone, the flashlight trembling in my hand. "Sarah, let me in." The whisper seemed to seep through the walls of the truck, wrapping around us like a suffocating fog. I turned toward the back seat, expecting to see Mrs. Henderson asleep, but what I saw instead made my blood run cold. Mrs. Henderson was staring straight ahead, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her lips moved silently, as if repeating something over and over. "Dr. Carter, stop the truck!" I shouted. He slammed on the brakes, and the truck skidded to a stop on the deserted road. The tapping stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the distant fire and our ragged breathing. "What's wrong?" Dr. Carter asked, turning to look at me. "It's Mrs. Henderson," I whispered. "She's not herself." We both turned to look at her. Her lips continued to move, whispering something we couldn't hear. Then, slowly, she turned her head to face us. Her eyes were pitch black, void of any humanity. "Sarah," she said in a voice that wasn't her own. "You let me in." Dr. Carter recoiled, fumbling to open the driver's side door. "We need to get out of here." But before he could move, Mrs. Henderson lunged forward, faster than should have been possible for someone in her condition. She grabbed his arm with a grip that made him cry out in pain. "Drive," she hissed. Dr. Carter struggled, his face twisted in fear and pain. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it directly into her face. For a moment, she recoiled, releasing her grip on Dr. Carter. He flung the door open and stumbled out, dragging me with him. The two of us stood in the middle of the road, gasping for breath. The truck sat motionless, its engine still running. Inside, Mrs. Henderson, or whatever was possessing her, watched us with a twisted smile. "We can't leave her in there," I said, my voice trembling. "She's not Mrs. Henderson anymore," Dr. Carter replied, his voice grim. "We need to figure out what's happening. Why is this thing after you?" I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "I don't know. I didn't do anything." Dr. Carter paced back and forth, muttering under his breath. "There has to be something that triggered this. Think, Sarah. When did it start?" I closed my eyes, trying to remember. The fire. The tapping. The woman in black. "It started with the fire," I said slowly. "It's not natural. It's something else. Something ancient." Dr. Carter stopped pacing. "What do you mean?" "I think the fire is a doorway," I whispered. "A doorway for something to come through. And we let it in." Before he could respond, the tapping resumed. But this time, it wasn't coming from the truck. It was all around us, on the road, in the trees, in the very air. "Sarah." The voice was everywhere, surrounding us. I grabbed Dr. Carter's arm, panic setting in. "We need to move. Now." We ran down the road, the tapping following us like a relentless drumbeat. The smoke grew thicker, the air hotter. The fire was closing in, but it wasn't the flames I was afraid of. It was the thing that had come through. We stumbled upon an old gas station, its windows shattered, the sign hanging crookedly. Dr. Carter pushed the door open, and we hurried inside. The air was stale, the shelves covered in dust. "Do you think we're safe here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter shook his head. "I don't know. But we need to find answers." He began searching the shelves, looking for anything that might help. I stayed by the window, watching the road. The tapping had stopped, but the sense of dread remained. Then, I saw her. The woman in black stood in the middle of the road, her dress billowing in the windless night. Her eyes locked onto mine, and she smiled. "Sarah." I stumbled back from the window. "She's here." Dr. Carter rushed to my side, peering out the window. His face went pale. "She won't stop," he said. "Not until she gets what she wants." "What does she want?" I whispered. He shook his head. "I don't know. But we need to find out, or we're not getting out of this alive." The woman began walking toward the gas station, her movements slow and deliberate. The shadows around her seemed to twist and writhe, as if they were alive. "We need to go," Dr. Carter said, grabbing my arm. "No," I said firmly. "We need to end this." I grabbed a can of gasoline from the shelf and began pouring it around the room. "What are you doing?" Dr. Carter asked, horrified. "We can't let her get in," I said. "We have to destroy the doorway." As the woman reached the entrance, I struck a match. "Sarah," she whispered one last time. I dropped the match, and the flames roared to life, consuming the gas station in an instant. The last thing I saw was the woman's smile, untouched by the fire. Chapter 4, Now Everything is Clear. The flames roared higher, consuming the gas station in a chaotic inferno. Dr. Carter and I stood outside, panting, watching as the building burned to the ground. The woman in black had vanished in the blaze, or so we thought. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. "We need to keep moving," Dr. Carter urged, grabbing my arm. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "There's no telling what else might be coming." I nodded, my mind spinning. The fire around us felt unnatural, too deliberate, like it had a mind of its own. As we walked down the empty road, the air grew heavier, suffocating us with smoke and ash. Out of nowhere, a voice cut through the silence. "Sarah." I froze. It was the same whisper, soft and insidious, carried on the wind. Dr. Carter stiffened beside me. "Did you hear that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He nodded, his face pale. "We're not alone." Suddenly, the tapping returned, echoing from the trees on either side of the road. It was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, growing louder with every step we took. "We need to find shelter," Dr. Carter said, his voice tense. "Something is following us." We spotted an old church up ahead, its once white steeple blackened with soot. It looked abandoned, but it was the only place we could see that offered any kind of refuge. We sprinted toward it, the tapping growing louder, faster. Inside, the church was eerily quiet. Dust covered the pews, and the air smelled of mildew and old wood. The stained glass windows were cracked, casting distorted colors on the floor. We barricaded the doors with benches, then sat on the floor, catching our breath. "Do you think we're safe here?" I asked. Dr. Carter shook his head. "I don't know. But we need to figure out what this thing wants." I glanced around the church, my eyes landing on a tattered old Bible sitting on the altar. I walked over and opened it, flipping through the yellowed pages. Something caught my eye, a passage circled in red ink. "And the fire shall consume the wicked, and the shadows shall claim their souls." My blood ran cold. "Dr. Carter, look at this." He joined me, reading the passage silently. "It's a warning." "But what does it mean?" I asked. Before he could answer, the tapping started again. This time, it came from the roof. We both looked up, hearts pounding. "Sarah." The voice was clearer now, more insistent. The woman in black was here. Dr. Carter grabbed my arm. "We need to leave." "No," I said firmly. "We need to end this." I grabbed a cross from the altar and held it tightly. "She's not just a ghost. She's something ancient, something that feeds on fear." Dr. Carter nodded slowly. "Then we need to confront her." The tapping grew louder, echoing through the church. Shadows began to move along the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. The air grew colder, and the candles on the altar flickered, their flames dimming. Suddenly, the doors burst open, and the woman in black stepped inside. Her eyes were hollow, her smile twisted. "Sarah," she whispered. "You can't run from me." I stepped forward, holding the cross in front of me. "What do you want?" She tilted her head, her smile widening. "I want you to remember." "Remember what?" The woman's form shimmered, shifting. Her long black hair shortened, her face morphed. Suddenly, I was staring at a reflection of myself. "No," I whispered, backing away. "That's not possible." The doppelganger stepped closer, her eyes locking onto mine. "You let me in, Sarah. I'm the part of you that you tried to forget. The part that thrives on chaos and destruction." Dr. Carter grabbed my arm. "Sarah, what is she talking about?" Tears filled my eyes as memories flooded back, memories I had buried deep. The fire that destroyed my childhood home, the screams of my parents trapped inside, the guilt that had consumed me ever since. I caused the fire," I whispered. "It was me." The woman in black nodded. "You called me that night. Your anger, your fear, it gave me life. And now, I'm here to finish what we started." Dr. Carter stepped between us. "No. She's not that person anymore." The woman laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the church. "People don't change. They just hide their true selves." I gripped the cross tighter, my hands shaking. "I won't let you hurt anyone else." "You can't stop me," she said. "I am you." "No," I said, stepping closer. "You're a part of me, but you don't control me." The shadows on the walls grew darker, closing in around us. The woman's form began to flicker, her smile fading. "I won't let you win," I whispered. With all my strength, I plunged the cross into the ground. The church shook, and a blinding light filled the room. The shadows screamed, twisting and writhing before vanishing into nothingness. When the light faded, the woman in black was gone. The church was silent once more. Dr. Carter helped me to my feet. "Is it over?" I nodded, my heart still racing. "For now." As we stepped outside, the first rays of dawn broke through the smoky sky. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind a landscape of ash and ruin. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. "We survived," Dr. Carter said softly. I took a deep breath, the air still heavy with smoke. But the shadows never really disappear. We just learned to live with them. Chapter 5: Evil Must Be Destroyed. We walked through the scorched ruins of Santa Lucia, the silence pressing down on us like a physical weight. The once vibrant town was gone, reduced to ash and rubble, with the skeletal remains of buildings casting long shadows in the fading light. Our footsteps crunched on the charred ground as we moved deeper into the ruins, searching for any signs of life. "Do you think anyone made it out?" Dr. Carter asked quietly. I shook my head, scanning the empty streets. "I don't know. But we have to keep looking. Someone might still be here." We moved cautiously, our eyes darting to every flicker of movement, every sound carried on the wind. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and burnt wood, and the horizon shimmered with heat. As we turned a corner, we saw him, a man, barely more than a shadow of himself, slumped against a crumbling stone wall. His skin was gray and cracked, as if he had been burned from the inside out. His eyes were sunken, yet they held a spark of recognition. "Father Benedict," Dr. Carter whispered, rushing forward. The priest stirred, his head lolling to the side. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. I knelt beside him, pressing a water bottle to his lips. He drank greedily, coughing and gasping for air. You came back," he rasped, his voice barely audible. I thought it was too late. "What happened here?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What did you see?" Father Benedict's eyes locked onto mine, and a shiver ran down my spine. "The end," he whispered. I saw the end. Dr. Carter leaned in closer. "What do you mean?" "What end?" The priest's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the sky still shimmered with heat. "It's not just the fire. It's what lies beyond it. The veil is thinning. The darkness is rising." I glanced at Dr. Carter, my heart pounding. "You have to be more specific." "What darkness?" Father Benedict coughed, a harsh, rattling sound. "The war in Ukraine," he said. "It's not just a conflict between nations. It's the harbinger of something far worse." Dr. Carter frowned. "What are you saying? That this war is part of some apocalyptic prophecy?" The priest nodded weakly. "Yes. The war is a battle not just for territory, but for the soul of the world. It's a crack in the barrier between realms. If it continues, if it isn't stopped, the darkness will pour through. It will consume everything." A cold dread settled in my chest. "How do you know this?" Father Benedict's gaze darkened. "Because I saw it. I saw the signs. This fire is in California right now. A flood in Valencia, hot Spain where it almost never rains. Hurricane Helen in the southeastern United States. Disasters that shouldn't happen all at once." Dr. Carter shook his head. "Those are just natural events." "No," the priest said fiercely. "They're not. They're warnings. And the greatest warning of all is the war in Ukraine. Do you know how many lives have been lost? More than 1 million in just 3 years. That kind of death, that kind of suffering, it feeds the abyss. My throat tightened. And you think someone is orchestrating this? Father Benedict's eyes burned with intensity. Yes. The one behind it all is no mere man. He is a harbinger of the abyss itself. He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Vladimir Putin. Dr. Carter recoiled. That's absurd. Is it? Father Benedict asked. Look at the fresco in the Cathedral of Verona. It's called The Funeral of Satan. It was painted in the 14th century. Have you seen it? The figure of Satan, it looks exactly like him. The resemblance is uncanny. Do you remember this event, when in 2014 the Pope together with children released Doves of Peace? And one of the pigeons was attacked by a seagull and a crow. Yes, that was the first signal. What is happening now? That's right, Ukraine is being attacked by Russian and North Korean soldiers. The Notre Dame fire in 2019 was a second warning. It was this year that a new president was elected in Ukraine. I felt a chill run down my spine. You're saying Putin is, what? The devil? No, Father Benedict said. He is not Satan himself. But he is a vessel. A pawn. The darkness works through him. Every decision he makes, every act of violence, it tears at the fabric of our world. He had every chance to pull Russia out of the darkness, but he didn't want to. Couldn't. Money, power, murders took away his soul. A new president was also elected in our country, but his first steps scare me. He makes claims to the Panama Canal, Greenland, Canada. He wants to take away someone else's, that which does not rightfully belong to him. Putin did the same, and that's who he turned into. I hope this is all a bluff and our president will choose the right path. Because if not... He fell silent. Dr. Carter rubbed his temples. This is insane. Is it? Father Benedict's voice grew stronger. Look around you. The signs are everywhere. The fire that destroyed this town. The flood in places where floods should never happen. The war that drags on, killing innocents every day. It's all connected. And the longer it goes on, the stronger the darkness becomes. I swallowed hard. What happens if we don't stop it? Father Benedict's expression was grim. Then the veil will tear completely. The abyss will spill into our world, and the darkness will reign for decades. We've seen it before, in the darkest periods of history. The Inquisition. The World Wars. The Holocaust. Each time, the darkness finds a way to break through. Dr. Carter paced, his mind racing. But wars have always happened. Disasters have always happened. What makes this different? Father Benedict's eyes locked onto his. Because this time, the darkness isn't waiting. It's actively pushing through. The war in Ukraine is the key. It's the largest conflict in the world right now. It's where the most blood is being spilled. And blood is what the abyss feeds on. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. What do we do? I finally asked. The priest's gaze softened. You spread the truth. You make people see. They need to understand that this isn't just politics or history. It's a battle for the soul of humanity. Dr. Carter shook his head. People won't believe us. Then show them the signs, Father Benedict said. Show them the fresco in Verona. Show them the disasters. Make them see that these things are not coincidences. I nodded slowly. And if they still don't believe? Father Benedict closed his eyes, his breath rattling. Then prepare for the darkness. Because it will come. And when it does, it will be relentless. The priest slumped back against the wall, his strength fading. I've done all I can. The rest is up to you. Dr. Carter and I stood in silence as the last breath left Father Benedict's body. The sky above us was clear, but the air felt heavy with the weight of what we had learned. But why me? Why did this woman in black come to me? This is the only thing that was in my head. How can I, a simple nurse, be associated with events of such a scale? Of course, if this is all true. Yes, that's true. Unfortunately. As we walked away from the ruins of Santa Lucia, the faintest whisper echoed on the wind. Sarah. I didn't look back.
Belief is irrelevant. The darkness knows you, whether you accept it or not.
The Sleep Capsule. It was a Friday night in a sleepy town in southern Idaho, Riverside. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and the air always smelled of wood smoke and fresh pine. My name's Jack Harris, and I wasn't exactly a man of adventure. I worked a steady job at the local auto shop, spending most of my days under greasy hoods or fixing flat tires. But life, as they say, can get dull in a town like Riverside. The kind of place where people stop paying attention, forget to look out for the cracks in the pavement, or the odd sounds that sometimes echo through the woods. That evening, the world seemed especially still. The sun had set behind the mountains, casting a deep purple hue over the town, while the first signs of the night's chill crept through the cracks in my old house. I leaned back on my couch, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner of the room the only sound in the house. It had been a rough week, late hours at the shop, not much sleep, and an aching back. So when a knock at the door interrupted the stillness, I had half a mind to ignore it. But curiosity tugged at me. I opened the door to find a young woman standing there, clutching a small package wrapped in brown paper. She was thin, her clothes simple, nothing unusual, except the intensity in her eyes. She looked nervous, like she was waiting for me to say something, but I didn't know her. "Are you Jack Harris?" she asked, her voice shaking a little. "Yeah, that's me. Can I help you?" I said, already preparing for some kind of sales pitch or charity request. But instead, she handed me the package without a word. "What is this?" I asked, inspecting the plain, unmarked wrapping. The girl didn't answer immediately. She just looked at me, her eyes wide, as though she was afraid to say something wrong. "I'm not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But, you need to take it. It's for you." I didn't know what to make of it, but the weird tension in her voice sent a chill down my spine. As if compelled, I took the package and stepped aside to let her leave. Without another word, she turned and walked down the porch steps, disappearing into the night. I closed the door slowly, the package heavy in my hands. A feeling I couldn't shake filled me. Something wasn't right, but my curiosity pushed me forward. Inside the package was a small, cylindrical object, no bigger than a coffee mug. It was made of smooth, metallic material, with strange, intricate patterns etched into its surface. There were no markings, no labels. I turned it over in my hands, inspecting it closely. A small note slipped out from beneath it as I turned the object, and I unfolded it, reading in a hurried, scrawled handwriting. Use it when you're ready to sleep. You won't wake up until you're done. I paused, unsure whether to laugh at the strange note or to throw it out the window. But something about it felt wrong. The words, the tone, it was too cryptic, too urgent. I had to know more. That night, after a long day, I found myself staring at the capsule on the bedside table. It glinted in the dim light, almost inviting, as if it was beckoning me to take it. The note kept replaying in my mind. It seemed ridiculous, like some kind of prank or joke, but something deep inside me urged me to try it. Maybe it was just my tired mind playing tricks, or maybe the need for something different was so overwhelming that I was willing to entertain the most absurd possibilities. I put the capsule on my nightstand, beside my alarm clock. Then, after a few moments of hesitation, I lay down in bed, shutting my eyes. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock, the usual hum of the house. But then, I felt it. The room grew colder. The air seemed to tighten around me, as if the very walls were closing in. I opened my eyes, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching and twisting unnaturally. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the capsule on my nightstand. It was glowing now, faintly pulsing with a soft, eerie light. Without thinking, I reached for it. As soon as my fingers brushed its surface, a sharp jolt of energy shot through me. My body stiffened, as if every muscle was locked in place. The room around me blurred, the edges of my vision flickering like a dying light bulb. The walls seemed to melt into a vast, empty void, and I felt myself falling, being pulled, into a strange, new reality. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My body felt weightless, and I was surrounded by a swirling fog of colors and shapes that didn't belong to this world. I could no longer distinguish where the floor ended or the sky began. It was all just a chaotic swirl of nothingness. And then I saw it. In the distance, like a beacon in the dark, was a shape, a figure. A silhouette, standing tall amidst the chaos, its features barely discernible in the shifting mists. I tried to move toward it, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into the fog, the figure growing larger and closer with each passing second. But as I reached out, something dark shifted in the fog. A shadow loomed overhead, and a cold, oppressive presence settled around me. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The figure in front of me slowly began to form, its face twisting into something grotesque, like a mixture of human and something far worse. It grinned, its mouth opening unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Welcome to the world you can never leave," it whispered, its voice like a rasping breath in my ear. My pulse quickened. I tried to scream again, but nothing came out. I was trapped, bound to this nightmare, and I had no idea how to escape. The capsule had done its job. And now, I was just another lost soul, wandering a world that would never let me go. I woke up the next morning, cold sweat drenched over my body, my heart racing. The room was still, quiet, just as it had been before. The capsule sat on my nightstand, still and silent, like it had never been touched. But I knew what I had experienced wasn't just a dream. I would never be able to wake up again. Chapter 2: Signs of Dread. The days that followed my strange encounter with the sleep capsule felt unsettling, like the calm before a storm. At first, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some kind of bizarre dream, the product of my exhausted mind playing tricks on me. But the nagging feeling never quite left. The air in my house seemed heavier now, more oppressive, as if the walls were quietly closing in on me. It was subtle, just enough to make me doubt my own sanity, but not enough to give me any solid answers. The first odd thing happened the morning after I'd experienced the dream, or whatever it was. I woke up, still feeling the cold weight of fear hanging over me. The house was silent, the only noise the distant hum of a car passing by on the road outside. I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of the night's terror. But when I looked at the nightstand where I'd left the capsule, my heart skipped a beat. It was no longer there. For a moment, I thought I'd just misplaced it. Maybe I'd put it somewhere else without thinking. But when I checked the entire room, under the bed, in the drawers, behind the nightstand, I found nothing. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe I'd put it in the kitchen or dropped it somewhere while I was half asleep. But deep down, a voice whispered that something was terribly wrong. I got up, shook off the fear, and decided to go to work. The familiarity of the auto shop, with its greasy tools and the smell of gasoline, usually grounded me. It was routine, something I could hold on to. But even there, I noticed strange things happening. First, it was the hammer. I'd left it on the workbench the night before, but when I came in that morning, it was on the floor, several feet away from where I'd last placed it. I chalked it up to clumsiness, maybe a sudden gust of wind from the open window pushing it off the table. But then I noticed something else. A wrench, one that I used nearly every day, was gone. Just vanished. I checked the shop. Every corner, every shelf. I even called out to my coworker, Steve, but he wasn't in. The place was empty, the silence pressing in on me. Still, I forced myself to laugh it off. I was probably just distracted, too tired to remember where I put things. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. Later that day, I stopped at the diner to grab a quick lunch. Molly, the waitress, gave me a strange look when I sat down at my usual booth. "You okay, Jack?" she asked, her brow furrowing as she set down a cup of coffee in front of me. I stared at her for a moment, confused. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Why? You look off. Like you've seen a ghost or something." I chuckled awkwardly, trying to shrug it off. "Just tired. You know how it is." But I noticed the way her eyes lingered on me, the unease in her voice. It was like she knew something I didn't, and the thought stuck with me, even after I left. That night, when I returned home, the capsule was back on my nightstand. I hadn't seen it in hours, but there it was, exactly where I'd left it. The strange markings on its surface seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I didn't know how it had gotten there, no memory of retrieving it, no explanation for its sudden reappearance. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, wondering if it was somehow connected to the bizarre events of the day. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. My fingers hovered over it, but I pulled away, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that I needed to understand what was happening. I needed answers. I didn't sleep much that night. I spent the hours tossing and turning, trying to shake the feeling that someone, was watching me. And in the brief moments I managed to drift off, my dreams were filled with the same swirling fog and shadows, the figure in the distance grinning at me. But there was something different this time, closer, more tangible. It wasn't just a dream. The following day, I went to see my old friend, Tom. He was a retired cop who had moved to Riverside a few years ago, and we had kept in touch over the years. He always seemed to know more than he let on, and I figured he might have some insight into what was going on. He was the kind of guy who took his time to think things through, even when everyone else was losing their heads. I went to his house around noon. He was sitting on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee, his usual quiet demeanor unchanged. "Tom," I said, sitting down beside him, "I need to talk to you about something. Something weird's going on." Tom didn't look up at first, his eyes scanning the neighborhood as usual. But then he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Weird, huh? What kind of weird?" I explained the situation, the capsule, the missing objects, the strange feelings I couldn't shake. I left out the more personal parts, like the nightmare, the way the figure grinned at me. That was just too far-fetched, even for someone like Tom. He listened quietly, nodding every so often, but he didn't say anything for a long time. "Well, that sounds like trouble," he said finally. "Maybe it's just your mind playing tricks on you, Jack. You're under a lot of stress, right? Or maybe someone's messing with you, playing some kind of prank." I shook my head. "No, Tom. I'm telling you, this is real. Something's wrong." He studied me for a moment, then sighed. "All right, Jack. But whatever it is, you need to stay grounded. Don't let it control you." I couldn't help but feel a little frustrated. It was as if Tom was just brushing it off, like I was imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the world was starting to tilt, just a little bit. That evening, as I sat alone in my living room, the sound of the wind outside picking up, I heard it again. A faint whisper. Just on the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from the direction of the bedroom. My heart stopped as I slowly turned to face the door. I didn't know what was waiting for me on the other side, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was out there, something I couldn't explain. Something that wanted me to know it was real. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending otherwise. Chapter 3, The Real Horror. The nights had become unbearable. Each one felt like a descent into madness, a battle between waking and sleeping that I couldn't seem to win. The whispers were constant now, lingering at the edge of my hearing, like a soft hum that never ceased. They were coming from the capsule, the one thing I couldn't seem to escape. I tried to ignore it, tried to push it to the back of my mind, but it was impossible. I couldn't go another night like this. My eyes felt like they were about to fall out of my skull, and the exhaustion had begun to seep into my bones, making every movement feel like a monumental effort. It wasn't just the sleep I'd lost, it was my sanity. Every corner of my house seemed to pulse with a strange, suffocating energy, as if it was closing in on me. I hadn't even dared to look inside the capsule again after it had appeared at my bedside a few days ago. But that night, I made a decision. I was going to confront it. I had to know what was happening. I stood in the darkened room, staring at the capsule on my nightstand, the faint glow from the markings casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers were louder now, almost like they were calling my name, urging me to open it. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. Every instinct told me to turn around, to walk away, but I couldn't. I reached out with trembling fingers and touched the capsule. The instant my skin made contact, everything changed. The room seemed to warp around me, the walls bending and stretching like rubber. I pulled my hand away, but it was too late. I was falling into darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me was nothing but shadows and shifting, swirling shapes. I couldn't tell up from down, left from right. It was like being trapped in a nightmare that had no end. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I opened my eyes, gasping for air, but the room I found myself in was not my own. The air was thick, heavy, and the smell of something rancid hung in the air. I stumbled to my feet, my body weak and disoriented. The floor beneath me was cold, made of cracked stone. I was in some sort of underground room, its walls lined with strange symbols and markings, all of them glowing faintly. A figure stood before me, shrouded in darkness, its features impossible to make out. My heart pounded in my chest as it took a step forward, its eyes glowing like burning embers. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was frozen in place, unable to comprehend what was happening. The figure stepped closer, and suddenly, I was flooded with memories, fragments of my life that didn't belong to me. Faces I didn't recognize, places I had never been, and a strange sense of déjà vu that made my head spin. The memories felt real, like I had lived them, but they were not mine. "You've been here before," the figure said, its voice now a whisper. "And you will return." Before I could react, the world around me began to crumble, the floor breaking apart as though it was made of paper. I fell again, deeper into the void, and this time, I couldn't stop it. I couldn't escape. When I landed, the world was different, brighter, yet somehow more suffocating. The landscape around me was barren, twisted. Trees that looked like skeletal remains reached up toward a blood-red sky, and the ground beneath me was cracked and dry, as though it had been scorched by something far beyond any fire I could imagine. I was no longer alone. Figures moved in the distance, humanoid shapes, their faces obscured by hoods or masks. They walked toward me, their footsteps silent, their presence oppressive. "You've come to the place where all dreams end," a voice whispered in my ear. I spun around, but no one was there. "And now you can never leave." My heart raced as I turned, trying to make sense of what was happening. But it was all a blur, a whirlwind of shapes and sounds that made no sense. I ran, but the ground seemed to shift beneath me, the path constantly changing. Then, I saw it, my capsule, sitting in the center of a dark, swirling vortex. It was glowing brighter than ever, and as I approached, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. It was calling me, pulling me toward it. I reached for it, but before I could touch it, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, and there was Steve, my old friend, the guy I worked with at the auto shop. But he wasn't Steve anymore. His eyes were wide, filled with terror, his face pale as if he had seen something far worse than death. "Don't do it, Jack," he shouted, his voice full of panic. "You don't understand. You can't go back." I tried to speak, but my voice failed me. I wanted to ask him what was happening, but the words didn't come. The capsule was now mere inches from my hand, and the pull of it was unbearable. It was like I was being consumed by it. Steve reached for me, his hands trembling. "Listen to me," he begged. "It's too late. You opened it, now you're trapped. This place, it's not real. It's just a place where nightmares live. And once you're here, you can never leave." I reached out, ignoring his warnings, and the moment my fingers brushed against the capsule, everything changed again. The world spun wildly, and then, everything went black. I woke up in my bed, the familiar sights of my room around me. For a moment, I thought I had dreamt it all, the strange land, Steve's warning, the terrifying force of the capsule pulling me in. But as I glanced at the nightstand, my heart stopped. The capsule was there. And it was glowing. That was when I realized the truth. The capsule wasn't just a sleep aid. It was a gateway to something far worse, a prison that kept me bound to a world I couldn't escape. I had opened it, and now, there was no turning back. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around me. I wasn't alone in this house. Something was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. And I had no idea how to fight it. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't wake up. There was no escape. Chapter 4: The Confrontation. I had never felt more alone in my life than I did at that moment. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with tension, as if the very walls were closing in around me. The soft glow of the sleep capsule on my nightstand was the only thing that illuminated the room, its pulsing light casting strange shadows that seemed to dance and twist in the corners of the room. It beckoned me, like a siren, calling me back into its depths. The whispers had become deafening, all-encompassing, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. They had been guiding me, drawing me into their web, and now, I was trapped. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the capsule. My body was shaking, my mind racing. The sense of dread that had been building for weeks finally reached its peak. something was coming. I could feel it in my bones, a presence that had been lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to take that final step. Then, the whispers stopped. I froze, holding my breath, trying to listen for any sound. But there was nothing. The silence was oppressive, like the calm before a storm. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked toward the capsule. My hand trembled as I reached for it, the cold metal of the surface sending a jolt through my fingers. I had to open it. I had to know what it was hiding, what it wanted from me. But as I touched it, a sharp pain shot through my chest, and I staggered back. The room around me began to warp again, like it had before, but this time, the sensation was stronger, more violent. The walls seemed to pulse and writhe, the shadows stretching and bending in unnatural ways. And then, the ground beneath me cracked open, swallowing the floor with a deafening roar. I fell, tumbling into the abyss. This time, I didn't land in the same strange world I had before. This place was different. It was darker, colder, and the air felt thick with despair. The landscape was a twisted version of my own reality, a distorted reflection of the world I had known. The sky above was a sickly green, and the ground was cracked and blackened, like the earth itself had been scorched by some unseen force. And there, standing in front of me, was the figure from before, the one that had been haunting my dreams. But now, it wasn't just a shadow in the distance. It was real. It was here. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, its voice cold and echoing in the empty space. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My body was frozen in place, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The figure took a step forward, its form shifting in and out of focus, as if it couldn't decide what it was. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning through me. "Do you understand now?" the figure asked, its voice low and guttural. "You've always been here. You never left." A sickening realization hit me like a physical blow. I was trapped in a cycle, an endless loop. The capsule had done this, it had opened a doorway, not to another world, but to this one. To the place I had been running from all along. I tried to speak, to ask what it meant, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was too horrifying, too impossible to grasp. "The capsule didn't bring you to me," the figure continued, its form growing larger, looming over me like a dark cloud. "It only showed you the truth. You were always here, Jack. You've been here before. And you will always return." The ground beneath me trembled, and I looked down to see cracks forming, spreading outward from where I stood. I could hear a low, rumbling sound, like the earth itself was screaming in agony. "Why?" I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. "Why me?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. "Because you opened the door. You sought the escape, but there was no escape. There never was." I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The memories, the faces, the places I had seen in the capsule, they all came rushing back to me in a torrent. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was my punishment. A consequence of something I had done, something I had set in motion without realizing it. I had created this hell. "You did this," I said, my voice shaking with disbelief. I'm the one who. The figure nodded slowly, a cruel smile playing at the edges of its lips. Yes. You opened the door, and now, you belong here. Forever. Before I could react, the ground beneath me cracked open, and I was pulled into the darkness. The last thing I saw before I was consumed by the void was the figure's face, its eyes burning into mine. And then, there was nothing. I woke up in my bed again. For a moment, I thought it was over, that it had all been a dream, a nightmare. But when I looked around, I realized the truth. The room was the same, but something was different. The air felt wrong. The whispers were gone, but they had left their mark on me. I looked at the nightstand. The capsule was there, exactly where it had always been, glowing faintly in the dim light. But now, it wasn't just a sleep aid. It was a prison. And I had no idea how to escape. I was trapped, not just in this world, but in the endless cycle of torment I had created for myself. The capsule had shown me the truth, the terrible, horrific truth that I could never go back to who I was before. The life I had known, the people I had loved, they were all gone. Lost to the darkness that I had summoned. And yet, the worst part wasn't the endless torment or the twisted world I had opened. It was the knowledge that I was the one who had caused it all. I had opened the door, and now, I was bound to it. Forever. The whispers started again, soft and insistent, just at the edge of my hearing. The capsule was calling me once more. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't resist. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers made contact, the world around me shifted once more. The cycle had begun again.